Education webinar, Transforming Employee Development, a Manager's Guide, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by David Berke. Today's webinar will last about an hour. Now, note you can submit any questions that you might have, and you want to do that using the chat window. It's usually in your upper right-hand corner, but you can type in there any questions you have throughout the presentation, and then we'll either answer those right as they come in, if we have time for the live Q&A with David at the end, or as a follow-up by email. But all of your questions will get answered, so please use that space. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I am in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Our presenter today is David Berke. He is a principal at Lorsch Berke and Associates. David has more than 25 years of experience as a manager, individual contributor, and consultant in the fields of management, leadership, employee, and organizational development. He is a senior faculty member at the Center for Creative Leadership for over a decade, and he has worked with global organizations across the United States, Europe, and Asia. An author and co-author of several books on succession planning and leadership development, his most recent publication is titled Supported Self-Development, How Managers Can Use the Skills They Already Have to Develop Their Employees. Welcome, David, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And I want to thank everybody who's come on to the webinar, and I hope you find this interesting, entertaining, and useful. So why don't we start by looking at the picture of somebody you may know, or at least you may know his fear, because a lot of people, a lot of managers in particular, look something like this either internally or externally when they're thinking about having a feedback discussion. But what's interesting about that is that in other circumstances, feedback discussions are, and everything that goes with it are standard operating procedure. And the kinds of circumstances I'm talking about really are project status meetings. Now, if you think for a minute what happens in a project status meeting, they go something like this. The project implementer provides the status, the manager and the project implementer talk about that, what's going well, what's not going well. Some feedback probably gets exchanged. They may look at different plans to see if things need to change in some way or if things are on track. And if you think about that, that kind of discussion is pretty much the same kind of discussion that ought to be happening with development, as a manager and an employee sit down and chat about how the development plan is going. But for some reason, it doesn't. And I suspect one of the reasons it doesn't is because we're talking about something other than, because because development is treated differently than other kinds of projects. I think those meetings work because we're talking about basic project management. Basic project management is something that managers know how to do, lots of non-managers know how to do it, and even if they don't know how, they understand who's supposed to do what, and they understand, what's supposed to come of it. Development is a little murkier. Now, let me explain what I mean by basic project management. Essentially, what you're seeing here are the 4 bullets that I think every project manager does, whether the project is, implementing a massive technology change in an organization or doing something a little less massive in a department or for the organization as a whole. Managers work with the project implementers, with the employees, to set goals, develop plans to achieve those goals, provide the resources that are needed to do that, and then to conduct regular status meetings. And the underlying principle to the approach that I'm going to be talking to you today is this. If a manager knows how to do these things, these 4 things, then a manager has the basic skills he or she needs to support the development of their employees. So let me say that again. If a manager knows how to do basic project management, a manager has the skills that he or she needs to support the development of his or her employees. What that manager might not know how to do is to apply project management to development. And what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the webinar is how to do just that. So let me turn to the next slide and talk about, oops, I can't move this. Sarah. There we go. So we talk about a framework for applying to project management to development. What you see here, the development plan is the project. The employee, the project implementer, is responsible for planning and implementing the project and for providing status updates. The manager is responsible for providing the necessary resources and for managing the overall project, and both are accountable for results. Now, what I mean by managing the overall project is that there are some things that the employee, the project implementer, can't do, either because he or she is not at the right level or doesn't have the same kinds of connections that the manager does. And I'm talking about things like getting assignments to, to different sort of task forces, getting resources to attend a workshop, stuff like that. And so the manager is sort of looking over the whole thing and making sure that all the pieces play together. Now let's take this down to a little bit more detail. Here are the steps that I'm suggesting you would use. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about project management and then how it applies to development, which is these bullets that you see in front of you. The first thing that anybody does when they're starting a project is to figure out who's going to do what. You translate that here to agreeing on mutual expectations. The next thing they do is to figure out what they're going to work on and then define a goal. The translation to development is to identify what people need to develop and then put together the development goal. The next step with the project is to figure out, so how are you going to accomplish that goal? And then with, if we're looking at employee development, the next step ought to be, but often isn't, designing the development assignment, because the development assignment is going to actually, tell you what you need to do to accomplish the development goal. The next step for a project is putting together a plan, and it's the same really for development. You put together a development plan. And then those last two steps, implementing and so forth, and then when we come to the end, figuring out what was accomplished, doing lessons learned, those are the same regardless. So what we see here really is how you approach employee development through the lens of project management. Now, I think there are at least two benefits to this approach. There may be more, but there are at least two benefits to this approach. One, as I'm sure many of you know, learning happens a lot more easily when you're building on something that people already know. And I think there's no question but that lots of managers know a lot about project management. They know how to do that sort of thing. And so we're not having to teach people new language. We're not having to teach people new concepts. We're not having to teach, people about styles and things like that. This is something that managers know how to do, and they do it every day. The second benefit of this approach is that we're really focusing on a business process. We're not focusing on psychological processes. There's no mystery that lots of managers react negatively to psychology and the language that's associated with psychology. So I've intentionally used business processes because I want to talk the language of business to people who are familiar with that language instead of forcing them into a framework that they're not comfortable with. So having said all that, let me tell you what we're going to focus on for the rest of the webinar. And I want to talk about the first three steps in that six-step process that I just described. We're going to talk about establishing mutual expectations, identifying what to develop and defining the goal, and then how to design the development assignment. I'm talking about number one and number three because I think lots of times that doesn't happen, and it ought to happen because it makes things a lot smoother and more effective. I'm talking about number two, identifying what to develop and defining the goal, for two reasons. One, it makes talking about the third bullet a whole lot easier, and because when we define what to develop and define the goal, what you do there is critical for assessing progress along the way. So let's get to the first step, establishing mutual expectations. Here's why you want to establish mutual expectations. It's not at all uncommon if you don't establish mutual expectations that you're going to generate some misunderstandings at a minimum. But beyond the misunderstandings, misunderstandings can lead to mistrust, and and things can begin to break down. And there's absolutely no need to do that. And so establishing mutual expectations is pretty important. And very often what we find is that when people don't establish mutual expectations, the misunderstandings develop on both sides. It's not unusual, for example, for managers to have an expectation of themselves and employees to have that expectation too, that managers are going to know all the answers. And the fact is that most managers can't know all the answers, and even if they did know all the answers, that's hardly the point. The point is to help the employee learn the answers that he or she needs to learn so that they can be more effective on the job. It's also not unusual for both the employee and the manager, coming from different perspectives, of course, that the employee become an expert overnight. And the fact is that's totally unrealistic. The only time you become an expert overnight is when you're in a movie. So on both sides, it's really important to be clear about what's reasonable and what's possible. So as we look at here are the questions that I suggest that people think about when they answer and discuss when they're trying to establish mutual expectations. The manager and employee should answer individually and then come back and discuss what should the employee reasonably be able to expect of the manager during the development process, and then what should the manager be reasonably be able to expect as well. So in both cases, I'm emphasizing the word reasonably because it's pretty easy to have unrealistic expectations. Now, what I'd like you to do for the next, say, 30 seconds or so, and then I'll talk about some of the answers that I've gotten when I've asked these questions. What I'd like you to do is to sort of think about, so what kinds of answers do you think you would have as you try to answer these questions, whether you're a manager or not. If you're a manager, you're also an employee, and if you've been working with managers, and all of us have, either way, you can put your head into both camps and get a perspective in both ways. So take about 30 seconds or so and just think about, so what would your answers be, and then I'll sort of talk about the answers, some of the answers that I've got. Okay, and so as we're talking, I think it's, I'll just say a few words. It's not, what's interesting about expectations is that it's very easy to assume that our expectations are the same. And for reasons I've never quite understood, sometimes people are very reluctant to talk about what their expectations might be. But expectations really are at the foundation of having an effective relationship. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to turn to the next slides and talk a little bit about some of the answers that I've got. So it should come up. There we go. So here are some of the employees' expectations of managers. Take a moment or two just to read through these. I'm not going to read them to you. Take a moment or two to read through them, and then, I just want to say one or two things about them. So one of the things that I notice about this list is that what I see when I read this list is that what a lot of employees want, they want the manager to manage. They're not looking for a teacher. They're looking for a manager. They're looking for somebody who can take care of things so that the employee actually has the time and space and support to do the learning that he or she needs to do. And what the other thing I see when I look at this list is I see lots of opportunities for managers to act in ways that will help the employee to stay motivated. Now, I tend to be one of those people who think that, basically motivation comes from within. I can't motivate you, you can't motivate me. But I also know from experience that there are things managers do that will make it more likely that people will get motivated and stay that way, or make it more likely that they will lose motivation. And so when you look at this list, one of the things I see employees asking of managers is that they do those things that will help them to stay motivated. As we go to the next list, the manager's expectations of employees, one of the things I see here, take a minute or two to read it. I'm moving too fast. One of the things that I see here is that there are opportunities for the employee. What the managers are looking for is for employees to demonstrate that they're seriously interested in doing the learning. In other words, what I'm seeing here is managers saying, I want somebody who is motivated, who is on top of it, who is willing to waiting for me, to tell them and to take them by the hand necessarily, but to be proactive and move forward. And so in the end, what I'm seeing when I ask people these questions are really complementary expectations. The employees want the managers to manage, and the managers want the employees to do what effective project implementers do, which is to take charge and move forward, and if they have problems, to bring them with solutions to the manager. So at this point, what we've done is we've talked a little bit about what it takes to establish expectations between the manager and the employee. We're going to now move to step 2. And step 2, as you may recall, there's 2 elements to it. The first element is identifying what to develop, and then the second is writing the goal. And so we're going to start with identifying what to develop. Now, identifying what to develop really is a process of moving from the general to the specific. And what you focus on when you're trying to identify what to develop is knowledge and or skills. Now, I know this may sound obvious, but a lot of people think that development can do all kinds of things. And fundamentally, when somebody is developing something, they're developing one or both of those things, knowledge and or skills. Larger organizational impact may occur, but it doesn't occur necessarily from the development experience. It occurs from what else you do before, during, and after. So our focus here is on knowledge and or skills. Now, to give you an example of process of moving from the general to the specific, here's a general statement that I imagine you've heard more than once. You've heard managers say this to employees. Your presentations need to be better. Now, the challenge here, of course, is what is it about the presentations that need to be better? And we could have a list of what you see underneath that when we look at the specifics. There's four bullets. Now, we could have 50 bullets or 100 bullets, as we sort of dig through and try to get specific and so forth. But this is just to give you an example. The point is that you have the general, then you have specific elements of that, and then what you want to do is to look through those elements until you find the ones that seem to resonate the most with whatever the employee needs, and then dig farther in those until you find the 1 or 2 or 3 things that need to be addressed. Now, there are ways of identifying these specific elements. The most traditional way is doing a task analysis. That's not the way I recommend, and the reason I don't recommend it is because it tends to take a long time, and it's pretty difficult to do, and most people tend not to do it. But there are some other ways that make it a lot easier and are just as effective for what we're trying to do here. One way is simply to brainstorm it, and the other way is to use competency lists, because if you look at a competency list, there's competency lists for doing effective presentations, and there's a good chance that you'll be able to find competencies that will resonate, just as when you brainstorm, you'll be able to do the same thing as well. Now, when you're doing this, you should always use behavioral language. This is probably familiar to many of you, but it's something that it's easy to get away from. Behavioral language identifies something you can observe. Generally speaking, that means something you can see or hear. Now, because it's behavioral, because it's observable, it's not something that's subject to debate. We're not talking about intentions. We're not talking about almosts. We're talking about things that either happen or they don't happen. And the way you know that they happen or don't happen is because either you saw it or heard it or you didn't. Now, behavioral language enables you to do at least 2 things. It enables you to focus the development because you can be very clear about what you're looking for. It also enables you to observe performance and assess progress. You're looking at something, and then you can say, then you can assess how it's going. And my suggestion is that you basically, assessment is about answering these 2 questions. Do you know it? Can you do it? Because what you're doing is when you're building somebody's skill or knowledge, essentially what you're doing is you're saying, I need you to know something, I need you to be able to do something. And so as we're writing objectives and things, as we're writing goals, these are the things that need to be there. So here's an example. In fact, here's two examples of what I mean by do you know it, can you do it? So knows and can apply the procedure for returning merchandise, learn and be able to apply at least 2 active listening techniques during a coaching discussion. For both of these, what you're seeing is acquisition of knowledge and then application of that knowledge in particular areas. And you can tell whether they've learned it, and you can also tell whether they can do it. And if they can't, you should also be able to tell what needs work. Now, what I'd like to do is to spend just a second or two, say 20, 30 seconds, using behavioral terms can sometimes be a challenge for folks. And so what I'd like you to do is just to spend a few minutes, or not a few minutes, but a few seconds really, look at this list and jot down in the chat area, in the chat box, which of these things is written in behavioral terms. Now, it may be that none of them are, maybe that 2 or 3 of them are, but just sort of jot down which of these is written in behavioral language. Now, I sort of feel for this I should have like Jeopardy music in the background, but I promise not to sing. Robert says arrogant. Okay. And let's see. Somebody's saying good communicator, somebody says aggressive, somebody says none of them. Actually, lots of people say none of them. So, okay. Well, let me give you an answer. Let me give you the answer, which is that those who said none are correct. None of these are behavioral. And the way you can tell that really is just by looking at these things and then saying, well, let's take arrogant, for example. Generally speaking, when somebody's arrogant, the question if somebody tells me that so-and-so is arrogant, then the next question I tend to ask is, okay, so what are they doing that leads you to believe that they're arrogant? Now, if I can ask that question, then I know that there's something underneath it. And the word arrogant really is a container for all those behaviors that lead an individual to say that so-and-so is arrogant. Now, what's interesting is that you can look at certain behaviors and somebody will say that an individual is arrogant, but another person might say, oh, that person's not arrogant, they're aggressive. And it could be the same behaviors. And the third person could say they're not arrogant or aggressive, they're confident. Because very often, those behaviors mean different things to different people. And so what's important is to, when you see words like this, is to ask the question. So what leads you to conclude that somebody is arrogant or wise or creative or any of those things? Then you'll get the behaviors underneath that, and then you can begin to address the specific behaviors that you need to address in terms of skill or knowledge development. Okay, so we have talked about what it takes to identify what needs to be developed. Now the next step really is to look at writing the development goal. And what I've done here is, most of us know about SMART goals. Most managers I know know what a SMART goal is, and even if they don't know what a SMART goal is, when you talk about what's involved with a SMART goal, they go, oh, okay, I know what that is. So because SMART goals are used by so many people, it seemed to me to make lots of sense to use SMART goals as the basis for writing a development goal. But I add one more element, and that is an S at the end for skill or knowledge level. But before I get there, let me just go through this quickly because, everybody, it's not unusual to have different definitions for some of these things, and so I want to make sure that we're on track. S stands for specific and behavioral. What I mean by specific is behavioral, something you can observe, something that you can see or hear. Measurable, I add accessible and then, the knowing and doing, because very often you can't use a numerical measure to tell whether somebody has accomplished something, but that doesn't mean you can't measure or assess whether they can do it. You can measure or assess it by observing them. And so measure is not just numbers, fundamentally it's whether you know it or can do it. A is for achievable. but I'm saying it should be achievable and challenging. It's really easy to write a goal that's achievable, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a meaningful goal in any way. Relevant, when we're talking about development, relevant needs to be, what people are learning needs to be relevant to their job. Now that may seem obvious, but very often, as you probably know with adults and adult learning, is that adults learn best when they're learning something that they have to know to be successful on the job. If they're learning something that's a nice to know, then then there's always the question of as to how relevant this is. And that's one of the reasons why compliance training often runs into some challenges, is because people say, oh, well, okay, I may run into that in the next 10 years, or I may not. So relevant, it needs to be something that people are paying attention to. Time-bound means you don't have all the time in the world to do this. And then, as I mentioned before, skill or knowledge level, the S. So we go from SMART to SMARTS. And here's why skill or knowledge level is important. As you can see from this brief conversation here, the question is the individual, do you want the individual becoming an expert or not? And the fact is that, and that's a question that often doesn't get discussed, but it has tremendous impact on the amount of time somebody spends learning and the amount of resources that are put against that learning. If you want somebody to become an expert, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of resources, primarily money, but it also takes the individual away from whatever else they're doing. If you want somebody to just know about something or be able to find it, online or elsewhere, that takes a whole lot less time and a whole lot less money. So there isn't a right or wrong here, but it's really important to have a good idea of the level of expertise you want to accomplish, so that way, you can judge accordingly. Now, it may be that the employee gets exposed to something and they want to become more of an expert than you need. In that case, that's terrific, but the question is, what will the organization support? And that's a question that needs to be addressed in a straightforward way. Now, here's an example of a SMARTS goal. What we have here is identify at least 2 questions and their answers for each major point in the next presentation. And that next presentation could occur in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but for the next presentation. Deliver the answers with confidence. That is, by demonstrating knowledge and control of the material, by looking at the audience and no hemming or hawing. Okay, so what we have here is it's specific, it's observable, and the one area where we have this, this vague word confidence, we have a definition of confidence. You're looking at the audience, you demonstrate because you know the material, and you look right at them and you give them the answers in a straightforward way without a lot of hums and things like that. Okay, here's one more question, and I think we're going to do a poll for this, which means Sarah's going to come back. And what I want you to do is to think about and give me the answer for what usually is the next step. Do you prepare a plan? Do you determine how to accomplish it and then prepare the plan, or do you send the employee to HR and let them figure it out? And I see the poll is now open.
Yes, we've got some good participation here. So you'll click on one of those radio buttons and you'll only be able to choose one answer of the 3. Okay, we'll give it another couple seconds. It looks like people are switching answers around here pretty quickly.
That's good.
It is good.
People know the right answer. It's incredible.
That's right. I think they do. Okay, it looks like we have the majority of you in here, so I'm going to go ahead and share the results.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, this is encouraging. My experience has been is that most people just prepare the plan and they don't necessarily think about how to accomplish the goal before they prepare the plan. But in this case, it looks like a number of you, majority of you, see that you should accomplish, you figure out how you're going to do it first and then prepare the plan. and almost nobody is just sending people to HR to figure it out. So that's a good sign all by itself, because HR won't necessarily be able to help with that. So that is the right answer, determining how to accomplish the goal and then prepare the plan. And here's the reason why. If I can I get there? Oh, here we go. Okay, oops, we've got to go back now. The development assignment really is what you need to do to achieve the goal, and the development plan is how the assignment will be implemented. Now, the development plan is pretty important, because the development plan is how you schedule events so that you can accomplish the development assignment. It's where you put milestones in and all the other things that are, and you identify resources and things like that. So it's very important. But to do all those things effectively, you need to know what it is you're trying to implement. And so that's why I'm suggesting that we do the development assignment first, and then do the plan for how to implement that. So this is step 3 in the process that we're talking about. So here's my definition of a development assignment. Basically, it's the activities and experiences that when you put them all together, enable an individual to accomplish their development goal. Now again, what we're going to do here is to build on SMART. And again, the reason we're doing this is because with a SMART goal, people know what SMART is. So basically, they know the first 5 letters of this thing. So you don't have to retrain people on what that means. SMART, we added S for skill level, and now we add 2 others, E for engagement and ST for support structure. Now, what engagement is about is having the employee do some things that they will find interesting. Because if they're not interested in whatever the development activity is, then there's a good chance they're not going to do it, and the development activity is going to fail. And that serves no one. So we want to think about, and often this means you either ask the employee or you know the employee well enough so that you can figure out things that the employee will find challenging or interesting or something that will engage them. The other thing to pay attention to here, the other thing we're adding is an ST for support structure. And when I'm talking about support structure, I'm talking about different things you can do that will help the employee to know how he or she is progressing. Because, it's not always easy to get direct feedback. It's not always, somebody may not be available or they may not be very good at giving feedback. But whatever it is, there are things the employee can do to help themselves figure out how they're doing. For example, a simple thing to do is to have a procedure. If you have a procedure or a checklist that tells you how to do something, that can serve as a check for them to see whether they're doing everything they're supposed to be doing. Getting feedback from a subject matter expert is something that they may be able to arrange. One of the things I like to do for myself is actually I construct tests. I sort of say, here's what I think I ought to be able to do when I'm doing this, and I sort of write it down, and then I sort of see how I'm doing against that. Another thing to do, which we'll talk about in a minute, is recording. If you're doing a presentation and so forth, you can record that and you can take a look at it, and so forth. So there are a number of things that people can do that will help them to know whether they're succeeding, what their progress is. So we look here, and basically, we're going from SMART to SMARTS to SMARTEST. I've sort of rearranged the letters slightly so that we can continue to have an acronym that makes sense. And here's how it spells out. You have everything, and then at the end you've got engagement, skill level, and structure. Okay, SMARTEST. Now here's an example of how you might see that. I'm not going to read all of these to you. I'm sure that you can read them yourselves, but I just want to address 2 or 3 of these things. You have the goal. We've seen this development goal before. The specific development activity, and there could be several that the individual could engage in. The one that we're talking about here is conducting a dry run, a practice presentation, and then recording the presentation. The assessment here, how are we going to know as we follow through with SMART, how do we know how it went? Well, you review the recording alone. You also can review the recording with other people so that you can get a sense from other people how it went. You can also arrange to get feedback from people who sat in on the presentation. Now, when you do that, though, it's very important to be specific with those individuals who are giving feedback to let them know what you want feedback on. Because if you're just very vague in general and you say, can you give me some feedback on my presentation, on this presentation when I'm done with it, they may give you feedback that has nothing to do with what you want to know, or they may not be able to give you anything at all because they don't know what to look for. So help them out by telling them what you want. Okay, so when we look here at engagement, which is one of the things we've added, the employee likes challenges, and this is an area where she hasn't done well in the past. So again, the employee knows themselves well enough to know that they like challenges and they get motivated, by things like getting better at stuff. And then when we look at structure, what we have here is reviewing the recording and getting feedback and so forth. And again, this tells the employee how they're doing. Okay, so these are things that are particularly easy to do, but they're also things that everybody should. It's not hard to do, but it's useful. You just have to pay attention to this so that you can get it done. Now, we've talked about how to, a development assignment, and I've given you the criteria for a development assignment. But the question is, so how do you figure out what should go into a development assignment? What are those things? And my suggestion is that what you do is that you answer this question: what do I need to know or be able to do to accomplish the development goal? So in the case of being confident when you're doing presentations, so the question is, so what are the kinds of experiences I need to have for myself? Well, I need to, and some of the answers that you come up with when that's the goal is you need to find a way to identify, potentially difficult questions, and you need to be able to find the answers to that. You need to be able to communicate when you're standing in front of people, confidence, and so we define what that looks like physically, and then we practice that and so forth. So you have some research that's done. You probably have some book learning that's done. Maybe you go to a workshop on how to do presentations. You also do some practice runs. So there's a number of things that go into the different kinds of experiences that make up the development assignment. 70-20-10 is something that comes from research that was done by the Center for Creative Leadership. Gosh, I guess it was a few years ago now. But basically what they say is that 70% of learning comes from different kinds of assignments. 20% comes from other people, in other words, behavior modeling, questions, discussion, things like that. And that only 10% of learning comes from classes or workshops. And so I put this up here because as you're thinking about the different kinds of development activities that somebody could do as part of an overall development assignment, it's really easy, to just focus on classes and workshops. In fact, for those of you who generally just go directly from development goals to planning, the only way that works is when you already know what you're going to do in advance. And typically in that case, what you do is you send people to a workshop. There's nothing wrong with workshops, nothing wrong at all, but workshops are generally good for introducing people to concepts and knowledge, maybe getting a little bit of practice, but you don't get much farther than that. In fact, you don't even remember most of what you heard or saw, if you don't have an opportunity to practice. And that comes from assignments and different, task force assignments. Maybe you're given a special assignment as part of your job, but whatever it is, that's where you really nail down your knowledge and you get better at something. Okay, so we have talked about the first 3 steps in that process. There are 3 more steps to go. We're not going to be talking about those today, but I just have a brief description of what the 3 remaining steps are. As I mentioned before, when I talked about the planning, with the planning, you know the goal and what you need to do, but then you sort of break it down, figure out which steps you need to do. You write milestones, and by the way, when you do milestones should be in terms of observable behavior. You figure out who's going to do what, you figure out the resources that are needed, and so forth. An important thing here is that often managers seem a little bit flummoxed. They don't quite know, if they don't have experience with somebody learning something, they may not know what to do. But the truth is, there's almost always somebody else in your organization who's learning what the employee needs to learn. And so it makes a whole lot of sense to have the employee go talk to those people who had to learn what this employee is now having to learn. And the employee can get a whole lot of information about what it takes to learn it, how long it takes to learn it, and probably help on figuring out, what the planning process should be, what the milestones should be. And so, that's something that a manager ought to be able to assign to the employee, or, if the employee is not quite sure, maybe they can do some of these things together. But all of this stuff is doable, and it needs to be in terms of observable behavior. When we come to conduct the status meetings and so forth, a question that I sometimes get is that, so how will the employee, can you depend on the employee to actually provide honest status reports on how they're doing? And I guess my response in general is often, if you can depend on them to provide honest and accurate status reports when they're implementing any other project, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that with this. One of the reasons they can do that with every other project is because the manager knows what the goal is, and the manager knows what the milestones are. That will work with development as long as the manager and the employee know and agree on these things as well, and if they're behavioral, which is to say if they're observable. Finally, when we look at the conclusion, when you've reached the end of things and then you reach the end of the project, you assess outcomes, figure out lessons learned, and do next steps. It's the same with any project. So before I go to we'll do the summing up, and then I'll say one or two other things. One is that the basic notion here, the basic notion behind this, underlying this approach to development, is that if you have the skills to run a project, you have the skills to support the development of your employees. And the reason for that is that basically, you're doing the same thing. It's just a slightly different application. Number two, employees and managers have complementary expectations of each other. So, it's important to identify what those expectations are, because then everything will flow a lot more smoothly. And at the same time, recognize that, what employees are looking for is managers who are willing to manage. And what managers are looking for are employees who are willing to demonstrate through their actions that they really want to learn what it is they're setting out to learn. Use behavioral language to target development and facilitate assessment. We've talked a lot about that. And to assess, you simply ask and answer these two questions. Do you know it? Can you do it? Both the development goal and the development assignment are built on SMART goals, or at least the SMART formula. And the reason for that is because that means that a manager doesn't need to learn a whole lot more to carry these out. So with SMARTS, what we're doing is we're adding one thing, we're adding skill level, and with SMARTEST, we're adding two more things. We're adding engagement, so that the person will be interested in what they're doing, and we're also adding support structure so that the individual can know how they're doing. One last thing, which is that development is a project. There are lots of different kinds of projects that happen in organizations, and as I've talked to managers over the years, one of the things that I found is that, whenever you talk about development, it seems like it's something totally unique and different from everything else, and the truth is it's not. And as long as we allow managers to act and believe that development is unique unto itself, then managers don't necessarily view development as something that they can do because it's so unique and so different. If a manager has the basic skills to run a project, that manager has the skills to support the development of their employees. And I think that's it. So let me turn this back over to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. We do have some time here for some questions. So go ahead and send those in. And while we're collecting those questions, I just want to share with people how to get in touch with David. So you can reach him by email, david@supportedselfdevelopment.com. Check out his book. There's a link there, and there will be a link in your email as well. So be sure to check that out and reach out to him as well. And keep in touch with HRDQ. Our next webinar is coming up in 2 weeks, and you can register for that at HRDQ-U.com. And shop at our store. That's HRDQstore.com, as well as keep in touch with us with various news articles and pieces here through all sorts of social media. So why don't we dive right in, because I do have questions that are coming in. So continue to send us those questions, but we'll get started here. David, our first question here is from Michelle, and she's asking about coaching. Where do you see kind of coaching fitting into this? She sort of mentions that she was maybe a little surprised that you hadn't talked a lot about coaching, and so maybe you can respond a little bit to the coaching element to this.
Okay, well, basically this is very similar to coaching. I'm purposely not using the term coaching because, well, for 2 reasons actually. One is because the word coaching seems to evoke some negative reactions from lots of managers I've dealt with, and because coaching itself is so ill-defined. It can mean very different things to different people, and so there's a role for professional coaches. That is to say, probably a number of the people who've attended this webinar. But being a professional coach and being a manager who coaches is 2 different things. And so my aim here is to really try to have people help managers to develop their employees in a way that will really work and where language doesn't get in the way. And so if a manager does the things we've talked about today, I mean, you could call it coaching or you could call it development. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that we don't put barriers between the manager and the process of helping their employees to get more effective at what they're doing.
Great, great. We have some questions around personality and how either as a manager you work with different personalities. Kathleen specifically asks, how do personalities play into the employee expectations?
Well, obviously there are some people expect everything, and some people are a little bit more reasonable. My suggestion is that if you one of the reasons that I'm using project management as the frame for this is because when you're managing a project, employees get pretty clear about what the expectations should be, and if they're and what they can ask for and reasonably expect to get. And in that context, managers are pretty clear about what they can ask for and expect from their employees. So putting that frame on it as opposed to, say, the traditional development frame, which seems to remind people of school. It seems to remind people of being in high school or college, and all kinds of dependency stuff is under the surface when you have that kind of frame attached to development. And so my aim here is to eliminate that kind of thing by saying, hey, look, this is a project. I expect you to do certain things. You expect me to help you in certain ways. So let's work that out. But beyond that, I mean, if you get too involved in personalities, then it's really difficult then to pull back to talking about observable objectives and so forth. So my recommendation is, I mean, I understand that they're there, and I understand that it's useful to know what the limitations are of people, and in terms of their desires and expectations. But beyond that, there are certain things that in a work setting that you should be able to expect the employee to do and that the employee should be able to expect the manager to do. And I would sort of stick to that using a project frame as opposed to a strictly development frame.
And then as a follow-up question to that, David, how do you work with the reality that sometimes employees, do they always or maybe sometimes provide accurate information on how their development is progressing?
Well, I chatted a little bit about this in the webinar, and this depends really. I mean, this is something that the manager and the employee together need to work out. You know, if you look at projects and you look at, you know, how people tell whether projects are on track or not, it's because people know, and it's because the manager knows and the employee knows what the milestones are. And the employee knows that the manager knows what those milestones are. And so because of that, you know, it's mainly a question of them saying, if the employee says, well, I've reached milestone such and such, you know, then it's simply a matter of the manager saying, okay, so milestone such and such means that you know X and you can do Y. So I want to see you do that. Let's observe it. And at that point it becomes, and this is no different, by the way, this is just a translation of what happens on a project. If somebody says, well, we've accomplished 60% of this, and here are the indicators that prove that we've done that. So this is just a way of translating that into, you know, you say you can do this, great, let's see you do it. And so if there's any fudging, it only happens once. This means, of course, that the manager's got to be willing to do that. You know, but if you do it once, you really only have to do it once.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, that certainly we have several questions coming in now around the unmotivated employee, that unmotivated person, and so so I would think your response there would apply to an unmotivated person as well. Is there anything around that unmotivated employee situation that you would add to that?
Well, you know, when I first put this together, one of the unmotivated employee people kept asking me, so what do you do with that person? And I think that the unmotivated employee is really, you know, it may be that if they don't want to develop, then, you know, there's really not a whole lot you can do to get them to develop. And then that becomes a matter really of a performance management process. And if that's where it goes, then that's where it has to go. But, you know, this whole approach is based on the idea that people are willing and interested in developing. And my own experience is that most people, you know, most people start out wanting to develop and to get better. For those people who, for whatever reason, don't anymore, I realize this can be challenging. So I'm not being a Pollyanna about this, but at some point you have to have the discussion and you have to ask, because the truth is that if they're not willing to learn, things are changing pretty fast, and if they don't keep up, then they really do fall behind in all kinds of ways.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and your time with us today. And
well, you're welcome.
Thank you. It looks like we are out of questions at this time, but feel free, send in any additional questions you have. I do have some very unique, specific ones to certain managers here, and we're going to reach out to you directly to dive a little bit more into your situations. So feel free, send us any additional questions. We will be sending out questions with answers in writing, so you have those from David, and that'll go out in an email early next week. And we do really appreciate your time and hope that you really found today's session informative.